Jamuna tiro bana chari. Jamuna tiro bana chari. Jaya Radha Madhava Punya Bihari. Gopijana Vallabha Giridharadhari. Gopijana Vallabha Giridharadhari. Yasodhanandana Vrajajana Randana. Yasodhanandana Vrajajana Randana. Yamuna Tiro Banachari. Yamuna Tiro Banachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Punya Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Punya Bihari. Jaya Paraman Samparibrajacharya Sukhavishya Smavati Tam Visarvami Bhagavad Jaya Nanda Kori Vaishnava Ki Jaya Ramachandra Krishna Haridas Thakur Ki Jaya Prem Sita Hosi Sri Radha Krishna Bho Gopna Sam Kanda Radha Kanda Giri Ki Jaya Vrindavan Dham Ki Jaya Navadip Dham Ki Jaya Skanda Mai Ki Jaya Jamuna Mai Ki Jaya Guru Dwarka Dham Ki Jaya Swami Bhaktivinoda Ki Jaya. All glories to them. All glories to them. Thank you very much.
Hare Krishna, everybody. Hope all of you can hear me and see my screen. Hare Krishna.
Yes, Prabhuji.
Okay. So it's 5 o'clock, 4 minutes. Saturday evening. We'll get started with today's class. Concluding session on second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. The contents of Bhagavad Gita summarized. So we are at the last 2 verses of this chapter. And then we'll continue on with chapter 3 today. So we completed through verse number 70. So we'll do 71 and 71 today. So in second chapter, we covered the analytical understanding of difference between the body and the soul. There was Krishna's explanation to Arjuna in response to the series of questions that Arjuna had asked, primarily 3 specific questions that he had asked. Then Krishna gave some arguments in relate to from worldly consideration. It's kind of a sub-theme, but Krishna lets Arjuna know that how will the people in general, how they will perceive things. They won't appreciate his kindness towards his relatives or his respect towards his grandfather and his teacher. They would just simply call him a coward. Then Krishna explains him that we should be motivated to do his duties without any desire for fruitive results. So that was the third theme. at the end of that theme, Arjuna asked, well, what is the symptoms of someone who has achieved such a state? And the essence of that, in responding to that question, the essence of Krishna's response was that how one should conquer desires, right? When one is not motivated by desires, then one can achieve such a stage. In order to do that, one has to restrain the senses from the sense objects, just like a tortoise withdraws its limbs when there is a threat or a danger. Then he explains what happens when the desires are given attention, right? They lead to attachment. From attachment, covetousness develops, and when the desires are not fulfilled, it leads to frustration and anger. When the anger comes, then the memory is bewildered, then it results into delusion, then the intelligence cannot function properly, and then one falls in the material whirlpool. So in this way, he gives different reasons, and rather explains further what happens when one is not able to control one's desires, and gives an examples of how rivers flow into an ocean, and so the desires are natural in the sense that desires come, just like the rivers, they enter into the ocean, desires enter into the mind, but one who is properly situated is not disturbed, just like the ocean is not disturbed. That was, I think there was another thing, there are a couple of other examples, just like the strong wind can sweep away a boat which is not anchored. Similarly, senses which are roaming, and the mind focuses on any one of them, then it can also bewilder one. So in this way, when one is disturbed by so many desires, then one cannot be peaceful, right? And without peace, there is no question of happiness. In this way, Krishna gives is further discussion on desires and what happens when one is not able to control desire. What can be achieved when one is able to control desires, and so this was the theme of the discussion so far. Okay, so we'll continue with the last two verses. This is verse number 71. Vihaya kaman yah sarvan pumanscharati nispriyah nirmano nirahankara sasantim adhigacchati. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Translation: a person who has given up all desires for sense gratification, who lives free from desires, who has given up all sense of proprietorship and is devoid of false ego, he alone can attain real peace. So here Krishna is elaborating on how peace can be achieved, right? So he's describing 4 aspects. But if you analyze these 4 aspects, there is a gradual escalation in its climatic. In poetry we have climax and anticlimax, and with Gita, like other scriptures, is written in a poetic form. So the ideas, there is a progression in terms of the stages of perfection. So the first is, well, one has to give up all desires for sense gratification, right? Now, having given up those desires, right, with some effort, anyone can do that, right? But anyone can do that momentarily, right? I give up my desires. But after having given up those desires, one has to continue to live freely from those desires. So you see there's a step up from the initial idea of just giving up. And then that is a little bit more sustainable as opposed to just giving up momentarily. And how is that possible? We have discussed that earlier. Cannot be artificially enforced, but one has to be positively engaged. And that's what the successive idea is. Well, who lives free from desires, well, somehow philosophically, one might be able to convince oneself to be and they are actively working hard to be free from desires, just like Vishwamitra, right? He was performing intense austerity for such a long duration of time, right? Well, obviously, if he was devoid of those desires. Otherwise, how can one be, fixed at one location, giving up other bodily engagements and be fixed in meditation? Well, one has to give up different kind of material desires. So it's not momentarily, but it's over a long period of time. But even in that state, there are many examples. Ravana, Hiranyakashipu performed austerities and they apparently gave up all other comforts and desires, but they had the sense of proprietorship, meaning that you might still think that, well, I am the enjoyer, I have given up this, right, for some time, but the idea is that I want to get some benediction to the dint of my austerities, and then I'll be able to enjoy unlimitedly, right? So even if one is able to apparently give up those desires for an extended period of time, one might not be free from the sense of proprietorship. So the next gradation up is that, well, not only one has to give up those desires for an extended period of time, one has to give up the sense of proprietorship, right? That means, one is not really doing tapasya, as we see in different scriptures. The example is given like Vishwamitra, or even asuras like Ravana or Hiranyakashipu. Well, they have not given up the sense of proprietorship, right? They want to be the enjoyer. So one has to overcome that state, and having overcome that state, there's one more stage beyond it. Well, one has given up the sense of proprietorship, but then one might still not be aware who the original or the real proprietor is, right? Because they are still covered by false ego, meaning that, by practical experience, they have realized that as long as there is a sense of proprietorship, there is suffering, right? And so they have philosophically convinced themselves that I need to give up the sense of proprietorship. So they are beyond this stage, but they might still not know what their real identity is, right? They don't know who the real proprietor is, right? So they are not fully covered or fully devoid of their false covering or the false ego. So the aham is still there, right? Nir ahankara, without false ego. So that is the final stage. For that, one needs to understand who the real proprietor is, right? Without that understanding, even if one is able to give up the sense of proprietorship, they don't know their real identity, and that means they have a false identity. What is the real identity? That one is an eternal servant of Krishna, right? Only in such a state one can attain a real peace, because otherwise what will happen is, as we see example of Hiranyakashipu, Ravana, or even sages like Vishwamitra, right? They are able to give up desires to some extent or for a certain period of time, but then eventually they fall down in the material whirlpool. So that peace is not santim, that peace is not permanent, it's not sustainable, even though from our perspective it appears to be for an extended period of time, but again, that's not sustainable. The purport Srila Prabhupada mentions, Srila Prabhupada, in his commentaries, he is emphasizing the devotional attitude, right? So the devotional flavor of Bhagavad Gita in Krishna's verses directly comes out as we progress further. But Srila Prabhupada has mercifully provided that devotional dimension or the context even in the earlier purports, though here Krishna is not directly talking about devotional service to Krishna, because still at this state, Arjuna has not realized that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, right? Earlier he was thinking Krishna is my friend, he's my cousin, but when he accepted Krishna as his teacher, then that was the beginning for Krishna to speak Bhagavad Gita. Now Krishna is kind of slowly ramping up, so he's not declared him as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He hasn't done that yet. He's just talking in a very generic way. But Srila Prabhupada is giving in his purports the real understanding, right? Somebody might pick up Bhagavad Gita, but they might not be fortunate to complete the Bhagavad Gita, or they reach to the later chapters, the 7th chapter, 8th chapter, 9th chapter, where the devotional flavor really comes out. I mean, actually, devotional flavor is there in all the verses right from the beginning, but it's kind of cryptic. It's not obvious, and Srila Prabhupada in his purport is making very evident, because we never know when death knocks at our door, right? So why should someone be bereft? If one has started this path right from the first chapter, one can get the devotional flavor, because ultimately that's the purpose of Bhagavad Gita. Bhaktyam mam abhijanati. I can be known only through devotional service, or bhakti. That's what Krishna says. So here Srila Prabhupada is mentioning that to become desireless means not to desire anything for sense gratification. In other words, desire for becoming Krishna conscious is actually desirelessness. So this is the real understanding of what it means to be desirelessness. Because artificially, there is never a point where the mind has no desires. Right? It will have some sort of desires. Right? If the sage Viswamitra is meditating, eventually wants to achieve some material benediction, or Ravana or Hiranyakashipu, they are inimical to Vishnu, and they want to also gain something, right? So at least in subtle consciousness, some kind of desires would always be there. So the real understanding of desirelessness is not have any material desire with the sense of proprietorship. To understand one's actual position as the eternal servitor of Krishna, Jiveshu Rop Hoy, Nityar Krishna Das, eternal servant of Krishna. Without falsely claiming this material body to be oneself, right? That means one is free from the false identity or false ego. And without falsely claiming proprietorship over anything in the world, is the perfect stage of Krishna consciousness. One who is situated in this perfect stage knows that because Krishna is the proprietor of everything, everything must be used for the satisfaction of Krishna. Arjuna did not want to fight for his own sense satisfaction. But when he became fully Krishna conscious, he fought because Krishna wanted him to fight. So obviously this is still not happened yet, but later, as Arjuna listens Bhagavad Gita and he's convinced, then when he decides to fight, he's evaluating things from a completely different platform. He's evaluating from a transcendental perspective. Earlier his criteria was, what is my sense satisfaction? He says, even if I win, I won't be able to enjoy, because all those with whom I would like to share my success, they would have died, right? So the frame of reference from which Arjuna was analyzing was materialistic, right? So real desirelessness means one is not thinking of one's own failure or success or one's own enjoyment. One takes the authority of someone directly of Krishna, as in the case of Arjuna, someone who is a representative of Krishna. For himself, there was no desire to fight, but for Krishna, the same Arjuna fought to his best ability. Real desirelessness is a desire for satisfaction of Krishna, not an artificial attempt to abolish desires, which is not possible. So we have discussed this elaborately in our previous classes. Living entity cannot be desireless or senseless, but he does not have to change the quality. But he does have to change the quality of the desires, right? So, as I say, the mind will always have some thoughts, desires are there, but then the desires should not be for one's own self-enjoyment, but the quality has to be changed. So one understands that Krishna is a proprietor of everything. Everything belongs to Krishna. Isavasya idam sarvam. Everything belongs to Krishna, right, then one can change the quality of the desire. It means one then wants to do it for the sake of Krishna. Just like I'll give you an example which would be relevant as we discuss the beginning chapters of beginning verses of the third chapter. Just like if I'm working for a corporation and I know the corporation is the proprietor of all the intellectual rights, the properties, right? So that's why when you take up a job, they would make you sign a bunch of documents. You have to maintain confidentiality. You cannot take company secrets and start your own business, right? Or if I'm talking with an important client for a business development deal, and then I would say, well, you know what, I have my side gig which is actually competing with the interests of the company. Those things are not allowed, right? So the one actually the desire is, if you think I want to directly gain something, right, then one gets into a legal trouble. But rather one when realizes, well, there is things, systems, processes, infrastructure, everything is there, the company is enabling that, and when one serves the interest of the company gives a salary to the employee, and the needs of the employee are again fulfilled, right? I mean, this is a material example, but it is important to know the proper understanding of who the proprietor is, right? So there is some analogy over here. So when one has a proper understanding, one does not falsely claim the proprietorship over anything, right? Because we think in that same example, how come I was able to even make contacts with prospective clients, right? It's on the the strength of the name and the brand of the company, right? So then to falsely claim the proprietorship, I can divert the business away from the corporation and I can do my own thing, so that is thievery, right? So similarly, self-realized soul realizes that everything belongs to Krishna, everything is provided by Krishna. This body that I have, which I obtained through the agency of my parents, was generated under the higher or the material energy, which is acting under the agency of Krishna, right? Whatever knowledge, whatever intelligence I have, that is also provided by others, right? And they are all again all ultimately, if you find the cause of the cause of the cause, we come to the conclusion that everything originates from Krishna. So even if one might be proud of their wealth or status or intelligence or abilities, all of that, none of that actually belongs to us, right? If we analyze it, we can come to the conclusion, any intelligent man can come to the conclusion that none of it belongs to us. And by proper study of the scriptures and hearing from learned self-realized souls, we understand that the Sarva Karana Karanam is Krishna. Ishvara Parama Krishna Satchidananda Vigraha Anadi Radir Govinda Sarva Karana Karanam. The cause of all causes is Krishna. And with that understanding, one can be situated that Krishna is a proprietor of everything and we are not the proprietor. So this transcendental knowledge is based on self-realization, namely knowing perfectly well that every living entity is eternal part and parcel of Krishna in spiritual identity, that the eternal position of the living entity is therefore never on the level of Krishna or greater than him. So what to speak about being greater than him, we cannot be even equal. So this understanding of Krishna consciousness is the basic principle of real peace. Santim Pati Gacchati. This is how one can achieve peace. Any questions on this particular verse?
Prabhuji, we hear this word false ego a lot. Can you elaborate on that? Like, I know it's a very deep topic, but like, why do we always mention false ego? Like the term false ego.
Yeah, false ego, ahamkar, nirahankar. We have to become nirahankar. So the there are different layers of covering on the soul. The soul in its spiritual original identity realizes that one is part and parcel of Krishna, and one is an eternal servant of Krishna, and is related to Krishna in one of the 5 forms of devotion: neutral relationship, servitorship, friendship, parental affection, and conjugal affection. At some point of time, when the soul desires to enjoy independently of Krishna, that means we have to forget our identity, right? If we cannot forget our real identity, then we cannot, enjoy independently of Krishna, right? Because the whole purpose why the soul, became envious for whatever reason, wants to. We won't go into that. I mean, we can discuss why it got envious, but the idea is that if the soul has decided he wants to enjoy independently of Krishna, because now he's envious, why Krishna has to be supreme enjoyer? Actually, the soul is happy. It's not a miserable situation in the spiritual world, right? It's not like a slave that one is serving Krishna. That's Krishna does not, in the spiritual world, as I mentioned, these 5 moods of devotion are expressed when Krishna and his devotees both forget that he is the supreme personality of God, and we are not worshipping him in awe and reverence, though there is some awe and reverence, especially in servitorship. But in higher rasas, the devotees do not know that Krishna is the supreme personality of God, and Krishna also forgets. So there is no question of supremacy in that sense, so that the loving exchanges can happen. But the flip side of that is, well, the soul might consider Krishna as an ordinary being, and there might be a situation where the soul momentarily thinks that, okay, why Krishna has to enjoy anyway. So then when the soul desires to enjoy independently of Krishna, then he has to forget that he is part and parcel of Krishna. That means the soul has to assume a false identity. Just like a lot of people, they take to intoxication because they are frustrated with their present material situation, right? And then they indulge in intoxication so that it gives them some sense of happiness. Why? Because they forget their real identity. Because as long as they remember that real identity, then it will make them remember the breakup that they had, or they're having a terrible time at work, or there are other problems in their lives that they are going on. They want to forget all that, right? And they want to assume an identity, another false identity, which makes them forget their real situation, and only at that situation they can enjoy. So think of it in that fashion. So the first layer of covering that the soul assumes is aham, right? Ahankar. That it's me, aham, right? I, not that I am part and parcel of Krishna, right? So Krishna is out. I am the center of the universe, right? So the first layer is aham, right? So now that identity is assumed, a false identity is assumed, and then there is a different variety of how, so that false ego then expands into, it successively acquires 3 more coverings, right? That's of mind, intelligence, and contaminated consciousness. That is man, buddhi, and chitta. So man is once I have an identity, a false identity assumed, right? Now I need to act on that particular false identity, and there could be so many different variations of false identity. I could not be Brahma or Indra or the president or a big businessman, or just an ordinary guy. But we, in due course of time, we assume different identities because by our desires and by our karma, we want to enjoy a particular kind of identity, and as long as our karma allows, we assume that. So that is, now when we have to act on it, so one needs intelligence. So intelligence gives us that discrimination in terms of selecting those ideas which will fulfill the desires that we have assumed that we want to fulfill for that particular identity. Like some people are interested in sports, but others are not, right? Some are attracted towards gambling, right? So the intelligence function is to make that discrimination to fulfill the needs of the false ego. False ego has assumed an identity, and intelligence says, well, this activity, right, does it fulfill the whatever the needs or the desires of whatever false identity I have assumed, right? So that's the function of intelligence. So then that's the natural outcome. Once the false ego is assumed, well, you need intelligence to act on it. And the mind, now you say the intelligence has to do discrimination, but then I need a medium in which there are ideas, and then the intelligence can act and discriminate those ideas. That means there is a need for mind, and so the mind is another covering that is created on top of intelligence. In a way, the mind provides that medium for those ideas to manifest and for intelligence to analyze. This is all need basis. You said so aham was the first need, then you need intelligence. Now intelligence needs to act upon something, then the mind provides that medium. And the mind can receive those ideas only in contact with sense objects. That means there's another layer of senses that is needed, right? And then the senses, they are integrated with the mind. And as we are studied in earlier chapters, that mind, if it focuses on any of the one of the wandering senses, right, then the mind is agitated. So then, so the senses sit on top of it, and now the senses, they also the senses itself are dull. The senses are attracted by the sense objects. That means, just like I have a charger for my laptop, but the power pin has to fit into a socket, right? So they are kind of almost created at the same time, right? But they're kind of dependent on it. So if it cannot be a non-standard pin, if I travel to a different country, I need an adapter because my charger won't fit into those power sockets in a different country. So the senses, they need to plug into the sense objects. That means the creation material energy that needs to create, it's not part of the body now anymore. The body only, it's not a covering on the soul. This covering on the soul only goes up to senses, but the senses interact with sense object, which is the sense of smell, taste, form, touch, and sound. So all these sense objects are created, and the sense object needs to be needs to reside somewhere, right? Smell does not reside in vacuum. Smell resides in maybe something fragrant like a flower, right? Similarly, the form does not exist in vacuum. The form is assumed by an object. So then there are objects created. There is earth, water, fire, air, ether, Panch Mahabhuta, the material, five gross material elements. They embody the five sense objects. Like earth embodies smell, and water embodies taste, and fire embodies form, air embodies touch, and then the ether embodies the sound. So again, this is all nested, but I won't go into too much detail. Because in this way, the successive the elements of the nature are created, and then 24 elements of nature are manifested in this form. So it's very systematic and scientific. Maybe I had mentioned this briefly in the previous classes, and Srimad Bhagavatam is described in much more detail. So this is all part of Sankhya, which means counting, right? Basically, studying the matter by analyzing it. So it's very sophisticated. It's not very simplistic in some of the other theologies of the world where you say, well, God created X, Y, Z on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday he took rest. So it's not as simplistic as that. It's quite complex, and there is a great succession to how these elements are created, and there is a philosophy and the epistemology of the entire understanding of the creation in much more detail. And and that is Sankhya philosophy of Kapila Muni. So yeah, to answer your original question, yeah. So aham is the first layer that envelops the soul when the soul wants to enjoy independently of Krishna. Does it help?
Thank you, Prabhuji. Yes, Prabhuji. Thank you.
Prabhuji Kashyap.
Yes. Yeah.
The verse says we have to give up all the desires for sense gratification. Are there any other desires other than sense gratification? Like a person might be aspiring to get some name, or I'm trying to understand. Sometimes I feel not all my desires are not actually for sense gratification. Maybe something a layer above it. I'm trying to understand that
Yeah,
part.
very good question. So yeah, there are different levels. People are of different nature. Some, well, most people, they are on a sensual level, and so when we say sense gratification, they are interested in gross sense gratification, which means they want to satisfy the urges of their tongue, belly, genitals, nose, ears, right? So this is the senses coming in contact with the sense objects, and it's direct sense gratification. Then some people, they are more on a mental platform, and they're probably not so much interested in gratifying their gross senses, but they are attracted by different mental propensities. You want to say maybe philosophy. They might feel, well, they can kind of get some sort of satisfaction in studying or mastering a particular subject matter, right? Or could be arts, right? Very artistic, could be poetry, literature, could be different creations in music. So the different art forms, it gives mental satisfaction, and that. So it's better than gross sensual gratification, but it's still, the mind is also considered a sixth sense, right? So that's slightly refined, but it's still, it's not meeting the needs of the soul. It's still on a mental platform. And similarly, there are beyond that, there are more intellectual pursuits, right? Which, beyond the art form, there are sciences, and somebody might get a satisfaction or gratification by dedicating oneself to the cause of science, different kind of sciences, but very intellectual kind of engagement, and they feel satisfied um, um, in such proclivities, right? And then there is in all of these, again, there is the element of pride that might come if especially someone is very uh, accomplished in their fields, and then that is ego, right? So aham, I am a great singer, I am a great musician, I am a great philosopher, I am this, I am that, and then and so there is a gratification of the false ego. So in this way, the gratification, the sense gratification, we say sense gratification, right? That's an English translation, but if you look at the Sanskrit, it just says kaman, right? So it's a generic. It applies to the gratification of the senses, the mind, the intelligence, and the ego. All of that falls into it. But in you kind of translate in English, Srila Prabhupada is translating is a sense gratification. Senses are also kind of instruments, right? Because whether it's knowledge acquiring senses or whether it is working senses, senses are instruments. So when we say sense, it is referring to all instruments, and mind is an instrument, intelligence is an instrument, and ego is an instrument, as I just explained, because each of them has a purpose. The purpose of ego is to, so that we can enjoy independently of Krishna. Intelligence has a purpose. So each of these are instrument. So here when we say senses, in a generic way, it's referring to all the instruments. In many Sanskrit verses, indriya, the indriyas are referred to as instruments. Just like my eye has limitations, right? And there's only certain resolution that I can see. There's only certain range that I can see, and I can extend that by using binoculars or telescope or microscopes, right? So that is an extension of the ability of the sense of seeing through external instruments. And my eyes are my internal instruments, but eye is still an instrument, and mind is an instrument. So to answer your question, senses doesn't just refer to the senses, but in the sense of an instrument, it refers to all, the entire covering of the soul, including ego, intelligence, mind, and the senses.
A follow-up question on that.
Yes.
So, how does one differentiate? Is it a desire or is it a nature? Like the four natures that we described before. Uh, uh, any thought that is coming? How does one differentiate it as a desire or a nature? Because it is not, as you mentioned, it is not at the sense level for satisfying the gross senses, but if it is more subtle, it is a bit difficult to differentiate what is a nature or what is a desire there, right? So is there any
Yeah.
suggestion on that?
So the as I explained earlier, the material desires, they are not, you cannot expect someone to give up material desires immediately. And so it is okay that one has those desires, but then those desires have to be regulated through dharma. And so the prescribed duties are there. Well, somebody has desires. Okay, you fulfill these desires, but they have to be regulated. In the sense, we'll study this in much more detail. But then the idea is that regulated, and not just regulated, that means one does not engage in grossly sinful activities. It means that one might have desire to taste or satisfy the tongue, but then the grossly sinful way of doing that is to eating all kind of creatures, right? But which is grossly sinful, consumption of meat. But that could be dovetailed. I mean, this one can eat wholesome vegetarian diet, right? So that's not grossly sinful. There's some regulation, but then beyond that, that could be dovetailed if the desire is still there, right? Okay, I'm eating vegetarian food, but I want to still satisfy my tongue. But when gradually one trains to make the bhoga for Krishna, right? Then that becomes when one is thinking not for my enjoyment, my Krishna's enjoyment, and then one takes the remnants as prasadam. So one is kind of dovetailing that that desire in service of Krishna. So that is a regulation there. Now, in terms of your original question, which is, if how do I know if my engagement is proper or not? So the well, at one level, the grossly sensual desires are there, right? Those also need to be regulated, and so this example of tongue is given. Similarly, listening, you don't want to listen any kind of mundane things, but you as much as possible, and then you want to hear more about Krishna, right? For instance, so that the hearing propensity is satisfied, but that is dovetailed. In terms of nature, what happens is if one engages in proclivities, so the four proclivities of Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Sudra, if one finds out what one's nature is and one is engaged according to that nature, even if one has these material desires, by doing this work, any work that we do, there are three dimensions to it. Well, the first dimension they recommend is, the scriptures recommend, is you want to select a work that is according to one's nature. And what I mean by that is, simplistically, if you want to apply in current context, is follow your blisters. I've talked about that. There was an article in Harvard Business Review, and I think it was Forbes. It says, well, work according to your nature is something that you would do even if you're not good at it, even if you, at least you're not good at it yet, or even if you do not necessarily like it, right? Or even if you are fail at doing it, you're propelled to kind of do because you kind of relate to that cause. So when it's situated in that fashion, that is an activity based on one's nature. But by being engaged in such activity, one still wants some remuneration, right? Because the material desires are there in order to satisfy the kama, right? But one won't be, by following dharma, that dissatisfaction of those gross desires is not sinful. It is regulated, right? And beyond that, one actually offers is as a yajna. We'll talk about that later in third chapter. But the point is that these desires will eventually, the gross desires or even subtle, eventually will subside by the law of diminishing returns, right? Because the nature of the material world is that the soul does not get satisfied with matter. It does not get permanent and everlasting satisfaction. It's like if I'm hungry, the first morsel gives me the highest satisfaction. By the last morsel of food, I don't even have room probably to have that. So law of diminishing returns, one is loses the taste for gross sense enjoyment. But because one is engaged according to one's nature, what will happen? Because they are propelled to be attracted by that kind of work, whether they fail or succeed, whether they like it or not, whether they are good at it or not, right? When they're following their blisters, then they are properly situated in their nature. And then what they will do, they will act as a matter of duty, and the results of the work would be offered as a sacrifice for the satisfaction of Vishnu, which is one of the first verses of third chapter, as we will discuss. So in order to answer your question, having said this background, how do you know? I know you're not asking for gross in regard to gross sense gratification, but you're subtly thinking that if I'm doing and pursuing something, am I satisfying, trying to gratify my mental proclivities, my intellectual proclivities? I'm just trying to satisfy my ego. Is it what's happening, right? So the answer to that is that, well, instead of worrying so much about that, I think if one tries to be engaged in an activity that is really according to one's nature, and one takes up this spiritual path, eventually those, even if those mental, intellectual, or false ego gratification desire for that is there, it will go away by law of diminishing returns. Eventually, over a period of time, um, that will go away.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Yeah. Like, even if somebody says that, there are so many examples where even if one is not following a spiritual path by practice, they get hard knocks in life, or they might generally people are envious about someone who is in the same field. An author is envious of another accomplished author who is writing in the same genre, right? But as one gets mature, one will see that, okay, as I cannot be the only author, right? There's always going to be people who are good at it. Rather than being envious, one is intelligent, appreciates and learns from someone who is accomplished. And in case of devotees, this is materialistic people who don't have an idea, but then those who are taken spiritual path, they know that, well, the source of all energy is Krishna, Sarva Karana Karanam. So by philosophically analyzing and understanding also, they can quickly overcome the desire for feeling false pride or prestige. Well, just like Prahlad is telling his father Hiranyakashipu, who is surprised that, hey Prahlad, how come you are so fearless? You're not afraid of me. All the demigods, demons, everyone's afraid of me. How come you must have so much strength and power that you're not affected by all the all the troubles that I'm creating for you? I'm trying to kill you and you're not affected. And so he says, well, the source of my energy is the same as the source of your energy. So Prahlad is able to see it's all coming from Krishna. So similarly, devotees, because they are studying Bhagavad Gita, they realize that even if I, at some point, or even if I still have some sense of false prestige, by every incident when that prestige, false pride comes, one philosophically tries to understand that, well, this is all coming from Krishna. If somebody has it, again, the source is Krishna. So then they start to appreciate, and when they start to appreciate, that appreciation itself becomes devotional service. He says, oh, this person is such a nice artist. This person makes such a nice paintings. Well, where does this ability come from? It must have certainly come from Krishna. So you see, he sees Krishna everywhere. So that the envy now becomes appreciation. And so that will go away in due course of time. So one should, one needs to act, and so it's better to pick up an act where one is propelled to act no matter what the situation is. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, Prabhu. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, the last verse of second chapter. Esha brahmi sthiti partha nainam prapya vimuhyati sthitavashyam antakalepi brahmanirvanam richati. Translation: that is a way of the spiritual and godly life, after attaining which a man is not bewildered. One is thus situated, even at the hour of death, one can enter into the kingdom of the God. So, the kind of body one acquires on quitting one's current body depends on the consciousness of the individual at the time of death. Because, and what it means is that whatever desires we have cultivated, whatever attachments we have cultivated all our life, that's what we will remember at the time of death. Because when we are about to lose everything, right? Some people live in one house for so many decades, they get attached to the house and they have to move to a different city or even a different house in the same city. They have memories and so many things. It's not easy to give up. What to speak about giving up one's body, right? With the body goes, all the relationships and all the possessions, everything goes away. And so just like if there is an accident, one will remember what is most dear to one. Just like their parents, if they're going in a car and there's a child in the car seat behind and there's a crash, parents are naturally attached to the child. The first thing they are concerned about is my child safe, right? So it's a natural instinct. Similarly, at the time of death, naturally we will remember what we are attached to the most. And one cannot artificially try to remember God or Krishna at the time of death. We will naturally remember what we have practiced all our life, and so that's why we have the practice of sadhana bhakti. If we adjust or modify our life to put Krishna in center, then naturally at the time of death, we will remember him. But one cannot artificially do that. So, in order to cultivate that, well, one has to first of all make sure that one is not bewildered by the upheavals of life, the upswings of the roller coaster, the upswing and the downswings of the roller coaster, right? Sometimes things are favorable, sometimes one are not favorable. One should not be disturbed. One way of doing that is that one does not have material desires, right? One is situated in one's prescribed duties, and then if one is impelled by one's nature, then one is situated. It doesn't matter one succeeds or fails. That's one's nature. Continue to do, even if there are every work has some faults, but when one is engaged according to this nature, those faults are overlooked. It does not become a big deal. So we have to model our life where we have an engagement of work that is more suitable to our nature. And then we understand that Krishna is the proprietor of everything. We're not materially motivated. And then the material desires will go away by association, by applying philosophy, and by law of diminishing returns. There are three things acting. The law of diminishing return is always acting, but when we also have philosophical understanding of how things are happening, who is the ultimate proprietor and the enjoyer, then we can make even quicker and a faster progress. And be situated, be not be bewildered, and then engage in spiritual practice up until and even at the time of one's death. Purport: one can attain Krishna consciousness or divine life at once within a second, or one may not attain such a state of life even after millions of births. It is only a matter of understanding and accepting the fact Khatwanga Maharaj attained this state of life just a few minutes before his death by surrendering unto Krishna. So, in 9th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, we find a description of Maharaj Khatwanga. So, he was a king and a very accomplished Kshatriya. He was helping the demigods fight against the demons, asuras. In previous yugas, we had this very powerful kings, almost like demigods, though they are on this earthly dimension. And so some of them were even able to help the demigods in their fight against the demons. They're so powerful. So having done that for many, many years, I can't remember the time, but for a long period of time, the demigods are very happy by his service. And so they said, what do you want, Maharaj Khatwanga? We are very pleased. We are the demigods. We are the administrators of this universe. We have authority or jurisdiction over so many different aspects or powers or features. We can grant you any benediction, like different kind of enjoyments, prestige, power, or property, wealth, and things like that. So they were offering Maharaj Khatwanga. Maharaj Khatwanga again was very intelligent, self-realized soul. We say, okay, even if you offer all this me, first of all, before I before I tell you what I want, first of all, tell me how long am I going to live, right? So Yama is also one of the demigods. So demigods have the ability to see how long our life is. And so demigod, so depending on that, I'll ask, what's the use if I cannot even enjoy, right? So you first tell me how long I'm going to live. The demigods reply that, your time is up almost. Your life actually won't extend beyond one muhurta, which is like 48 minutes approximately. And so Maharaj Khatwanga, he says, okay, so he knew what's the purpose of life. And so he says immediately, just like Maharaj Parikshit, when he knew that he only has 7 days to live, he gives up his kingdom. He is the ruler of the entire world, right? He is a descendant of the Pandavas, actually grandson of Yudhishthira. Not Yudhishthira, the Pandavas. Yeah. So similarly, Khatwanga Maharaj, he says, immediately leaves his palace. He gives up his all responsibilities. And he says only a 48 minutes. So he sits down, he meditates on Krishna, and then he reaches the kingdom of God. So whatever consciousness one has at the time of death, that's the destination one achieves. So here Srila Prabhupada is saying that it's just a matter of understanding and accepting it. Right? One can do it within a second. Right? If one gets the essence and accepts it, or one cannot do that even after millions of births. So the example of Khatwanga Maharaj is given. Nirvana means ending the process of materialistic life. According to Buddhist philosophy, there is only void after the completion of this material life, but Bhagavad Gita teaches differently. Actual life begins after the completion of this material life. So the material life, we assume different false identities. We don't know what our real identity is. One life, I think of myself as Indra, the king of the heaven. Another life, I might be a pauper on the street, or the president of a country, or a worker in a factory. Different kind of false identities we have assumed, and we have forgotten our real identity. So when our material conception of life or material life ends, we realize our spiritual identity. That is the actual beginning. Otherwise, it's all hallucinations. It does not show any real purpose in achieving everlasting peace and happiness. So for the gross materialist, it is sufficient to know that one has to end this materialistic way of life. But for persons who are spiritually advanced, there is another life after this materialistic life. So those who are Buddhists, they have, they think, well, the spiritual perfection of nirvana is voidness. They don't have the idea about the positive spectrum on the other side of that void or zero. That's why they are nihilistic. Sunyavadi, right? Sunya is zero. For the gross materialistic list, it is sufficient to know that one has to end this materialistic way of life. What Prabhupada is trying to say over here is those who are at least frustrated but they don't have spiritual knowledge, they might just want to end that materialistic way of life, but then they don't have the idea about the higher positive life in life of engagement in the service of Krishna, which is pleasing and satisfying to the soul. Before ending this life, if one fortunately becomes Krishna conscious, he at once attains the stage of Brahma Nirvana. Nirvana, here, the word used is Brahma Nirvana. Right? So it's not the Nirvana of the Buddhist conception, which is just nullification of the material, but Brahma refers to the ultimate truth. So it emphasizes the positive aspect of the liberation and not simply nullification of the negation. It's beyond that. There is no difference between the kingdom of the God and the devotional service of the Lord. Now Srila Prabhupada is presenting an even higher concept, in the sense that, well, one thing is, one actually goes to the spiritual world, but when one is actually situated in the devotional service of the Lord, then even in this material world, one achieves the same satisfaction and perfection, right? There is no difference. One can be on this earthly dimension and one be fully engaged in the devotional service of the Lord, and that is not any different from being in the kingdom of the God, because one has understood the essence of loving service to Krishna, right? That is the main essence. That's why in Bhagavatam it says, Narayana para sarve na kutaschana bibyati swarga apavarga narkeshu api tulyartha darshina. So those who are devotees of Narayana, for them everything is equal. Api tulyartha, tulya, equal vision. They see with equal vision what? Swarga, heavenly planets, apavarga, even liberation, or even the hellish situations, right? Because no situation can waver them away from their dedication or devotion to the Lord, right? So in that sense, there are so many examples of self-realized souls who, while being on this earth, achieve the same perfection as being on the spiritual dimension, right? They're not there in this Goloka Vrindavan, but while being on the earth, they are engaged in the same level of intensity of service, and they satisfy the Lord, and equally they get the unlimited spiritual bliss. So it's a very different concept. So the devotional service is very important. In some of the other theology, the idea of God is there, the kingdom of God is there, but it's not very clear that what is the nature of living, or even the eligibility to enter that. Say their understanding of the kingdom of God is more like the heavenly planets described in the Vedic scriptures, where they think, well, maybe it's like Las Vegas. They think, well, you go over there, you'll enjoy wine and women. So there's no concept of what it means to lovingly serve the Lord. So they take the material conception of life and apply that even to the kingdom of God, right? In certain theologies, and so it's way far away from reality. While the devotees, they do the other thing, right? Those who are pure devotees, they apply the essence of what the life in kingdom of God is, even to the earthly dimension, right? Just like those who have materialistic conception of even spirituality, they think the kingdom of God is a place of pursuing their sense enjoyment. Similarly, the pure devotees, they are so dedicated to the service of the Lord that even while being on the earthly plane, what to speak about being in spiritual world, or even in hellish situation, they are fixed in the proper understanding of spiritual realization, which is devotional service of the Lord. So you see there is an ocean of difference. There's an analogy, there is some similarity. Just like a materially contaminated person has a materialistic idea of spirituality and wants to extend such propensities even in the kingdom of the God. A pure devotee wants to be engaged in the service of the Lord even on the mortal domain, by meaning the domain where the body is subjected to repeated death. Since both of them are on absolute plane, to be engaged in the transcendental loving service of the Lord is to have attained the spiritual kingdom. See, Srila Prabhupada is specifying. Actually, there's no difference, right? So the success is not reaching the destination. That's not the sole criteria. The success is in the path. Like once somebody asked Srila Prabhupada, what is the ultimate objective you want to achieve by chanting Hare Krishna? So Srila Prabhupada replied, to get what we want to achieve is more opportunity for chanting Hare Krishna, right? So the instrument and the object, right, they are all same, right? So by chanting Hare Krishna, what we want to achieve, or the objective, is also chanting more Hare Krishna, right? So in spiritual plane, everything is absolute. There's no difference between sadhya, right? That is what sadhya, that is what which is worth achieving, and sadhana, the instrument that is used for achieving that. So in the material world, there are activities for sense gratification, whereas in spiritual world, there are activities of Krishna consciousness. So all it matters is consciousness. It doesn't matter where we are situated. Of course, initially in our practicing state, we don't have that realization. We are affected by our material conditioning. But when one makes advancement, all other external factors, they are not important anymore, right? I've given this example many times. Just like a businessman is going on a business trip, he's focused on having that business trip successful, and overlooks the inconveniences associated with travel, or lodging, or anything. He just is completely impervious to such situations. So similarly, when one is fixed in the service of the Lord, then everything else, favorable and unfavorable, does not make any difference. So attainment of Krishna consciousness, even during this life, is immediate attainment of Brahman. And one who is situated in Krishna consciousness has certainly already entered into the kingdom of the God, right? So it's not that one has to, one who is conditioned, for them, there is a difference. They think, I won't be subjected to all these threefold miseries of life. But those who are actually self-realized, those threefold miseries actually don't even affect them. So while they have already achieved the kingdom of the God while being on an earthly dimension. Brahman is just the opposite of matter. Therefore, Brahmasthiti means not on the platform of material activities. Devotional service of the Lord is accepted in Bhagavad Gita as the liberated state. Sagunan samatityaitan brahma bhuyaya kalpate. Therefore, Brahmasthiti is liberation from material bondage. So, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who is a great acharya in the Gaudiya lineage, he is the one who rejuvenated the Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which was lost after a few generations since Chaitanya Mahaprabhu disappeared. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in the late 19th century, reinstated or restarted the Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which was almost lost. At least the real essence of it was lost. A lot of that was watered down and corrupted. So he has summarized the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita as being the contents of the whole text. That's why Srila Prabhupada titles the second chapter as Contents of Bhagavad Gita Summarized. So in this chapter, we actually covered everything: Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga. Srila Prabhupada made it very apparent. If you just read the Sanskrit, it might be a little cryptic, because Krishna is kind of slowly warming up. As I said, he has not said, he has not declared himself as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He has used mostly, terms like yoga, and he defines yoga as, well, one should not be affected by success or failures. But he has not talked about yajna, because as soon as you say yajna, that means one has to say who is being worshipped in the yajna. So that's the topic of the third chapter. But Krishna does talk about karma yoga. He does talk about jnana yoga. Jnana yoga is same as Sankhya yoga, which is the analytical study of the world. Karma yoga, where Krishna was asking Arjuna to act without being worried about success or failure, as a matter of sense of duty. And then Krishna gives a glimpse of the Brahman, right? He mentions in this particular verse, and some other verse, what is the highest perfection, Brahma Nirvana, right? So he talks about serving. There's other verse, Bhakti Yoga is also translated as Buddhi Yoga in some places. So there is some glimpse given. So in the second chapter, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga have been clearly discussed, and a glimpse, yes, a glimpse of Bhakti Yoga has also been given as the contents of the complete text. Thus ends the Bhaktivedanta purports to the second chapter of Srimad Bhagavad Gita in the matter of its contents. So yeah, that's the concluding verse. Any questions or comments before we move into the third chapter? Anyone? Okay. So I know it's already 6:12 p.m., 6:13. We can start third chapter, or maybe we can conclude the class early and start the third chapter from next time.
Maybe we can